Hi, so this is a video to show off some of the new features of the Better Lit shader. This is the 2021 version, and its minimum required version of Unity is 2021.2.6. So why is the minimum version basically the version that came out last week? Because there was a bug fix that allowed some stuff to work, and additionally, the shader now takes advantage of the new unlimited keyword limit. If you're not familiar with keywords in Unity, they're basically an internal way to have multiple features on a shader that you can turn on and off, and they used to be capped at 64 per local, and now they are unlimited. So this allows me to take advantage of a lot more features. I've added a bunch of stuff to the shader. One example here is Tri-Planar Texturing, which is different than Tri-Planar UVs. Tri-Planar UVs is a technique where you project the same texture from three sides to prevent tiling issues. Tri-Planar Texturing is where you actually use a top, front, and side texture for things. And so basically you have, in this case, sand, grass, and rock. It's sort of a way to automatically texture. And this is actually available on every texture layer. So for instance, on this one, if we come down here, oh, I'm looking at the wrong material here. Tri-planar texturing. If we come down here, we have our UV mode set to tri-planar texturing, and this gives us a world or local space option that we can choose, and then we have a blend contrast between the three projections, and then we get three sets of textures for all of our textures. It basically works like anything else, just you get these three sets of textures, and that's also the case here on the texture layers. So if you want to blend a different texture layer, that texture layer could not be tri-planared, or could be projected, or tri-planar textured, whatever you want. So you have complete control over this on every layer, which is pretty nice. I have a system called Effectors. So if you're familiar with the dissolve system that's been in Better Lit for a while, what I have here is an example of using these effectors, which are basically objects that you can move around that will affect some parameter of the shader. In this case, I have them affecting this dissolve effect, and so you can move these objects around. They come in two shapes. They come sphere and plane right now, and so you can basically like cut off based on the plane or on the sphere, and get these to cut out part of your object. I can make these affect anything in the shader that makes sense to do this way, and so I went through some of the old effects. For instance, your texture layers can be affected by this, so you could move these around and have it blend in different textures using the texture layer system. You can use them on the dissolve system here, and then you can also use them on the wireframe, which is a new effect. You can play with the contrast here, and this controls essentially how contrasty the blend between these are. And then basically the way these work, it's described in the docs, but you have these little effector groups. And so you create this group, and then this has a number of effectors in it and a number of materials it will modify. So if you have multiple objects in the scene that want to be affected by this, you add them to this material list. And if you have, you can have up to, I think it's 8 effectors per system. And so, yeah, you can have up to 8 of these spheres affecting as many materials as you want. And then the effector itself just has basically the shape and the contrast. And if you look at the material here, open up this guy, and we go down to the dissolve system. Here, we just turn on use an effector, and then we can also optionally turn on inverse, which makes the system work the other direction. So now we're revealing areas where we want this, and I'm moving the whole thing, not the effector, instead of cutting it away. So yeah, I think that's pretty useful for certain types of effects. Let me go flip this back. There we go. Back here, we have a six-sided projection shader. I'd started on some ideas for kind of a stylized shader, and I just went ahead and added them now that we have unlimited keywords to this shader. And in this case, I'm using, we now have unlit options, and so I'm using an unlit shader, and I'm basically faking lighting by applying colors to the six sides. And a game like Monument Valley, for instance, uses this great effect. And the nice thing about this is this works kind of like post-processing. So you can set up all your textures and stuff. You can have snow, wind, rain, tracks, all that stuff going on here. And then you can apply this as a tint to any of that. So you can use it as a way to sort of post-process things and apply fake lighting to things if you want. You can also use it just by itself, as it is here for a Monument Valley style look. And the way this works is that you can choose different blend modes for the actual color. So for instance, I can do multiply 2x versus a tint. And then you can basically adjust the angle contrast, which won't make much of a difference here because we're on a bunch of cubes. And then you can choose the blend space, and you can use an RGB blend space, an HSV blend space, or an Oak Lab blend space, or OK Lab, I guess they call it. But and those are three common ways to blend between colors that have different trade-offs. And then essentially for each facing, so like for instance, this is the X facing. So that is going to be, X is our red axis here, because it's RGB is XYZ, and positive X is the direction the widget faces here. And so we can control the color projected from this side by changing this here, right, to create like a shadowy look or whatever. And then you can also, for each of these, you can choose between having no projection on this axis, having gradient, color, or single color. So the gradient will give you like a 2-color gradient. And then finally, you can use a texture if you would like to project an actual texture onto here. And so for instance, this is the gradient mode, and I can choose my 2 colors. I can choose whether I want to do it in the UV space, the local space, or the world space. And then I can basically set a start position and a size for that gradient, and I can rotate it. And I'll go ahead and go to one that's already set up, like this one here in the front. And you can see we can rotate this gradient around the center point if we want to give it an angle. And we can move the start position here along that axis, and then change the size of it to scale it smaller or bigger. And you can do the same thing with the texture projection. So there's a lot of possibilities with this in terms of like stylized scene rendering and lighting, and I think it integrated into this nicely, where it sort of acts after things are have been textured and all those things. So if you wanted to still have like a textured look, but wanted to have that side kind of like faked Monument Valley style lighting, you could do that. We've got a wireframe effect. This actually requires pre-processing the mesh. And so if I go into the better lit shader here, there's a mesh preprocessor that I can drag a mesh in here. And there's 2 types of things here. There's this existed before for displacement dampening, and now it has an option for barycentrics, which basically marks barycentric coordinates onto the triangles that it uses for the wireframe rendering. The nice thing about using this technique is that this works on all GPUs. It doesn't have to use geometry shaders or anything like that. The downside is that you do have to pre-process the mesh to put the barycentric data onto it. So yeah, but the nice thing is you can come in here and do wireframes on your object. You can choose different spaces for them, whether you want the size of them in local or world space. You can adjust the thickness of the wire. You can do the smoothing, which is basically like the fall off and that's a little sensitive on something this tight. Um, and you can change the color, the emissive, and the alpha function of it. So for instance, I have this as an alpha cutout, but I can put this on none, and then it just goes over whatever the texture is doing. I can do it as alpha, or I can do it as actual cutout, where it actually cuts out the thing. If you're on alpha, you need the shader to be in an alpha mode as well. It's not right now. And you can apply this wireframe to either the emissive or the albedo with whatever color you want. And you can also use the effector system so that you could, for instance, you could have like, you know, these effector balls move around and have it become wireframe when they are nearby, right? When they intersect with the object that you're doing. And so that's really cool for, like, you know, sci-fi games and effects like that. And I kind of want to do more sort of effects. So if you have particular ideas, let me know, because they're fun to program. What else here? Went over the Tri-Planar. I've done some work on the features themselves, like the old features, and we can talk about some of that. So the angle filter for the texture layers now has a lot more features. It can now be in local or world space. So it can be, you know, the angle you're choosing for the fall off. You can basically set a vector to compare it against. By default, this is up. But if I were to change that vector to like an X vector, then you can see it's going to put the moss on the side here instead of on the top. So you can use these for whatever projection you want. You can also mirror it. So basically now it's projected from both sides instead of just one side. And yeah, I think the rest of this angle filter is basically the same, but that got some nice improvements there. And I'm going to go ahead and change this vector to be an up vector. What are other new features here? There's a Vertex Coloring feature. If you, this is just sort of something I didn't have keywords for before, but if you turn on Vertex Color, if your vertices have color painted into them, then you can basically blend that either as a multiply 2x, or an overlay blend to do vertex coloring. And then there's also an alpha blend here, so you can basically apply the vertex coloring to the vertex colors alpha channel to either be an occlusion mask or an albedo map. And a lot of times people bake occlusion in there to do ambient occlusion, or you can have it just lighten and darken the albedo effectively. The amount of vertex coloring on the albedo. It's like a transparency. And then there's some new packing modes if you would like to use a metallic texture instead of using the type packing mode. Right now, it packs normal and then smoothness and ambient occlusion into one texture, and this lets you pack normal, smoothness, and metallic map into those textures. And then the AO gets computed based on the normal. It just does a little fake AO there to give you some of that. So yeah, I think that's most of the new features. There's kind of been general improvements through the whole thing. There is a material upgrader. So when you first open an old project, you come in here and go upgrade materials to 2021. And that will go through the materials on disk and adjust some things. I hope I got it all right. There were a lot of changes to the internals. One of the things that I did was the previous version of the shader, I had a limited number of keywords. And so what I did was, in some cases, I branched around things to basically, like, instead of using a keyword, because I didn't have keywords available. And so I could make the shader a little bit faster, especially on low end, on like mobiles and stuff, by turning some of those into compile variants. And so that's kind of what the material upgrader is mostly about. It does have some other things. So yeah, let me just check my notes here on the asset store listing and see vector system, wireframe money. Oh, so now noise, before the way that noise worked for the shader, if you had this like damaged wall, you would actually specify a noise kind of signature like function that you're going to use. Like I want to use 3-octave procedural noise with, based on a texture. And you would specify that for the whole shader. Now you can actually specify your noise on every use of the noise. So, for instance, this texture layer uses layer noise here, and we could actually change the noise from world to local space, or change the quality or type of noise, and do that per layer. So we could use whirly noise on one layer and regular noise on another. So that's a nice improvement that we get from having those extra keywords. And support for URP12 and HDRP12, I should point that out. And then, yeah, variant stripping. So I have this little system. One of the things I noticed is that the shader was getting quite large. And the reason it was getting large was because Bakery and a few other features will force Unity to compile both versions, because there's a global setting that's going to happen at runtime, and they need to have both versions available. But if you're not using Bakery, then that's a bunch of extra shader data that you're including that doesn't need to be there. And so I now have a way to strip that out. And what you can do is, if you go into, there we go, scripts, editor, and then in resources here is a Betterlit variant config, okay? And on this config, basically by default, it's going to include Bakery, LOD crossfading, and deferred rendering. So if you were to turn these on, then it's going to strip out all of these shaders, and this is a combination because it'll generate one with all the Bakery combinations, and then one with, like, say, the LOD crossfade, and one without. And if you know you're on a URP project and you're doing everything with forward rendering and you're not using the new deferred rendering, you can strip the deferred rendering variants, same for built-in, and that will save you a bunch of shaders that don't need to be compiled, and 2 don't need to be in the build. And so if you turn on all 3 of these, you drop the size of your build by about 24 megs or so, and you drop the compile time for the Betterlit shader from several minutes to several seconds. So if you're not using these features, you should go turn the ones off that you don't use, and it will save you a bunch of memory, build time, and build size, which on mobile is very important. So yeah, I think that's about it. There's a lot more capability in this. It's really nice to have an unlimited number of keywords so that I can really go nuts with this stuff. And as always, if you have particular ideas of effects or improvements to things, just let me know. And thanks for watching.